Welcome. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I'm the MDDC Executive Director, and I am delighted to welcome you to one of our, the third in our Moving Forward webinar series. Today, we're talking to Richard Karpel of the Public Notice Resource Center, and he's going to go over some of the critical things you need to know if you are carrying public notices in your publication. So, and Richard, just to acclimate you, we have a variety of small publications here from Maryland, Delaware, and DC, and some not so small, larger pubs that are all carriers of public notice. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
So let me do my screen thing here.
And while Richard's sharing his screen, I'll note that I'll man the chat. Feel free to jump in with questions as they arise, but you can also use the chat function if you need to ask me something in particular.
All right, so I'll get started. Well, thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me here today. I appreciate it. What we're going to do today, I think it's probably going to take about 30 minutes, something like that. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them after I'm done. So what I'm going to do is just give a real brief overview of what the threat is, the threat to public notice, and then we'll talk a little bit about best practices and the kind of things that you can do at your paper to help. Obviously, the main threat is legislative. Having said that, let me start off with a piece of good news. I don't know if everybody is aware of, but that all 50 states still require most notices to be published in newspapers. So newspaper notice is still the primary means of alerting the public in all 50 states. And so the main threats that we see are bills that would move all notices from newspapers to government websites. And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen 10 or 15 of those in 10 or 15 different states. So far, none. Well, I won't get into the details, but like I said, all 50 states still require notice despite those bills. So we've been successful fighting them off. So the one thing I do want to mention is when I talk about the bills that would move all notice from newspaper websites to government websites, more often than not, the legislation is couched as an either-or thing. So what they'll do is they'll add something and allowing local government units to publish their notices on their own websites instead of in lieu of newspapers. The reality is if that happens, even though there's still a component if they want to put it in newspapers, if that happens, we're going to lose public notice. So I count it as that's a loss, because once government get the ability to post the notices on their own website, that's clearly what they're going to do. So the other threat, not quite as acute as moving them all to government websites, is just what I call category killers. So, every state has spread throughout the code a number of different pieces of legislation or statutes that require notice in particular situations: tax assessments, delinquent taxes, unclaimed funds, self-storage, budget notices. So there's lots and lots of different kinds of notices. And what we see sometimes are just bills that would eliminate one of those notices. Sometimes they're major notices. In Wyoming right now, it looks like they're going to be facing a bill that would eliminate minutes, and they're required in the state to publish the minutes of the county commission and city council meetings, and they would lose those. That would be a big category for Wyoming. Having said that, I mean, most of these category killers, and I'm following it, by the way, for Public Notice Resource Center, we're following all 50 states in the legislation that's introduced. And so, more often than not, these bills are not about public notice, they're about something else. And the legislator just takes an opportunity to change the way the notice is provided. Now, having said that, okay, it's not working here. Let's see, is this my screen? Here we go. So I just talked a little bit about category killers. The reality is there are more bills that would add a newspaper notice, usually minor, but they are. So we see legislation. Again, most of the time legislation is introduced doesn't pass, right? And that's true of both the category killers and these other ones. So it's just, to me, and actually I would say you see more of these bills that would add a particular notice, again, real minor, almost usually. To me, it's important because an important sign that the legislative machinery is just spitting out new notices, right? So it's, again, it's usually a bill about something else, let's say something to do with elections, and they want to add an election notice. And so that's a positive thing to me, is that they're just automatically adding newspaper notice. All right, so
Richard,
now,
if I can
sure.
build on that for just a second, certainly in Maryland, that is when someone builds in, notice has to be given to the public. The default way that the legislative bill drafters put that in is through a public notice. So every year there's, like a little tweak, a little there. They either do it by first class mail, or if they're just trying to sort of generally give notice to the public about something, they will request it to be through a public notice. So it's kind of a philosophical piece. If that's the default way you do it, then that's the default way you do it.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's a good sign if the default is a newspaper notice in a lot of cases. I think that the reality is we'll see it in states. You'll see a state where there's a bill that's being fought over that would eliminate all public notice in the state. At the same time, you've got other bills that would add a particular notice. So to me, again, it's just a good sign. So it's not all gloom and doom when it comes to public notice. There's still a lot of support for it. So I think to me, the biggest threat is internal. It's us. The public notice has been running in some of our papers for over 100 years. And it makes sense that, they've just been there since we've been around. And so we take them for granted. We sometimes treat them like an entitlement. And ultimately that results in us not treating public notice clients like our customers. We need to change that. So we need to change our mindset around public notice. And I think the key here is circulation is down, right? And in some cases, you're even distributing fewer papers. Maybe it used to be daily, and now it's 2 or 3 times a week, whatever. There are fewer people reading newspapers, and that's something that we just cannot ignore. That's happening. Everybody knows that. And so we need to work harder to make sure that people are seeing the notices in our newspapers. And so let's talk now about some of the practices I think that could help us do that. First of all, this is a pretty basic one. They got to be readable. The type size needs to be readable. So if they're, our demographics are getting older, a lot of people reading the paper these days have trouble reading small print. Let's put it that way. And so you need to make sure the notices are big enough that people can actually read them. You also need to make sure that they're distinguishable from the surrounding text so people can read the notice, basic stuff, right? Let me show you an example of a way not to do it. This was a notice that I found a couple of years ago. It had something to do with oil rights or something. I think it's in a Western state. It was from a newspaper. I took a picture of it just to give you an example of what not to do. No one can look at this and make any sense of it at all. And so there was really very little care in publishing this. And so if your public notice page looks like this, you're doing it wrong. To me, when I see something like this, it signals that the publisher doesn't really care if anyone reads these things. And so we need to avoid sending that kind of signal. They need to be easy to find, right? I mean, so you can't just stick them in the back of the paper and forget about them. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be in the back of the paper. It just means you can't forget about them. I think we need to rethink how we do things, right? So if you're doing it, if you are putting them in the back of the paper, make sure that there's a way that you're finding a way for people to find them. An index in the front of the paper, make sure people understand that you've got notices there. So make sure that they're easy to find. So here's one way I would put this issue, both about readable type and where the notices are put. I mean, a lot lot of times, if you ask someone about like just a normal person, what do you think of public notice? And most people won't even know what you're talking about. Sometimes they will, and what will they say? Oh, those are the small ads in the back of the newspaper. I actually seen that description written in columns in our newspaper, people writing about public notice. Usually it's journalists, and they'll talk about the small ads in the back of the paper. If that continues, we're going to lose public notice. If that's the way people think of it, as just something that's back there that nobody looks at, it's gonna end up killing us. So they need to be easy to find. How do you do that? Well, you redesign the paper, or you redesign your public notice page to make it easier for people to read, easier for people to find. Now these are, so I put some bullet points up here. You don't need to take them down because I'll make sure that Rebecca has a copy of the PowerPoint. If you want that, you can take a look at it so you'll be able to see these later on. And the other point is, it doesn't mean that these things are the things that you got to do. I think the main thing here, and actually let me back up, these were all presented by a consultant, a design consultant who made a presentation at a best practices conference that we did with the National Newspaper Association 3 years ago. So these are just some ideas. The main thing I want to get across here is that we need to think fresh about how we present our public notices. I'll give me an example of a guy who did it a lot differently. So this is a paper in a small town in Kentucky. The guy who owns this paper was formerly an editor or journalist, and he was someone who reported on public notices, and we'll get into that in a second. But what that is he viewed them as news. He understood that the public notices that are published in his newspaper are news items, and so he presents them like news items. Now, this is another example of something that you don't got to do. Maybe it doesn't work for you. This obviously takes, you're using a lot of real estate, print real estate to do that. Again, the idea isn't that you have to do this. The idea is to rethink it, make sure you're bringing attention to your notices. Once again, circulation is down. We need to work harder to make sure people are actually reading the notices in our paper. And it needs to be print and digital. So when we fight this battle in the legislature, and we just talk to people about the public policy implications of notice, our opponents usually frame it as newspapers versus the internet, right? Newspapers versus the internet. If that's the frame, we lose. So we need to reframe the argument. And the real argument should be newspapers and newspaper websites versus government websites. Once again, newspapers and newspaper websites versus government websites. And the reason we want to do that is because newspaper websites receive a lot more traffic than government websites universally. And I would encourage you to check your own traffic statistics against the local governments in your community. Almost all the time, we have 10 times as much traffic, or some multiple. But we only can make that argument if the notices are published on your website. So it's real important that you do that. Now let me add another thing. You've now published it on your website. There's another thing, which is the same as with print. You got to make sure that they're findable. So you need to make sure there's a homepage link, so prominently displayed for public notice. One point here is do not make it classified. Don't put your notices in the classified section on your website, because people don't. You and I know that classified in some cases is where people publish notices. The reality is most people don't realize that. So it needs a clear index link pointing to the public notices on your website.
Hey,
Go ahead,
Richard,
Nora.
could I jump in for a sec? One of the things that we also do at the Press Association, I think most of the people on this call know this, but we do have an aggregated multi-jurisdictional site to showcase public notice ads from Maryland, Delaware, and DC. And so that's a critical part. We want to make sure public notices are in front of the paywall, and by uploading them to the MDDC site, where we keep them in the context of other news and information the general community is looking for, that allows us to reach a wider cross section. Some of our members actually use the MDDC site only as they use that as their public notice site, and don't really upload to their own site. One other tidbit that I wanted to add: we're in the middle of doing a readership survey. It's an advertising focused readership survey that we do every year. And right now we have, and it's open. Here's my little plug. It's open to every member who wants to run the survey. It's free. And so far we have about 500 responses, and it'll close in the next couple weeks. And we ask about public notices. So for 33% of the respondents felt that public notices, in terms of their reading habits in the news publications, were important or very important. And an additional 30% noted that public notices were somewhat important to them. So people do want to know what's going on in their communities. We characterize it as more of a right to know issue. And then further, when we get to that third rail issue, whether people prefer to have public notices on the in the newspaper or the newspaper website or government websites, 63% of respondents said that they preferred to have public notices in newspapers or their associated websites. And only 8.6% of people said they'd prefer to have them on government websites. So I think the public support is out there in recognizing it's not exactly a scientific survey, but I think that's pretty compelling in terms of the importance that people place on our notices.
Governments are not good at publishing. That's our job, right? And so that's what we do. And so that so I agree with you. And the whole thing about the statewide website is really important. You should do that. I think it's important that, just about every state has one. But I'm going to make it hard and say you got to put it in both places, because I think for us to be able to make the newspaper and newspaper websites argument, if you're not putting it on your own website, you're just losing the traffic that you have, the traffic advantage you have over the government websites. Plus, you need to put it on your state website, and that's important, especially as a defensive maneuver. Let me add one other thing here. This is actually, to me, this is the gold standard. It gets a little bit more difficult, which is email and text notification. I mean, that, to me, the easiest way to get people's attention is through email, or if they prefer text, through text. So to give people an option to read the notices that are published or to have the notices that are published in your paper delivered right to their inbox or right to their text, that's a killer to me. And I think we need to get there before the government gets there, right? And so to the extent that you can do that, to me, that's a gold standard best practice, is make sure that people or find a way that people can get the notices via email and text if they want them. I just did this presentation yesterday for the Florida Press Association, and it turns out that they have a law. So Rebecca talked about the statewide website that you guys have. There are 14 states that actually have a law requiring newspapers that publish notices to also publish them on the statewide website. So it's actually a law in those states that was encouraged by the State Press Association. In every case, that was a bill that was supported by the association in those 14 states. What I was going to add is Florida has one, and they actually require by law that newspapers provide email and text notification. Obviously, there are no police running around in Florida checking on that stuff, so there's no enforcement. But I think it was interesting that, and I think it's unusual, most of those 14 statutes don't have that requirement, but Florida does. But that, to me, is the gold standard, and that's something that would be really helpful for all of our members to be able to do. And now I'm just going to add something that Rebecca just pointed out, which is not behind the paywall. So really, you can't, if it's behind the paywall, find a way technically to take the notices from behind the paywall, because it's going to kill us if you don't do that. All right, so let's So I talked about this before, report on the notices in your paper. So as you can see, I've got a list of different stories here that landed with a big impact in these mostly small towns. These were stories that won an award. We have a contest on public notice reporting. So it's reporting that uses a public notice as a source. These are some of the stories that won. They don't need to be scintillating. I mean, there's a lot of news in your notices that you can report on. I think obviously, if you do find a way to report them out, you're bringing more attention to the notice, and that's always a good thing. Now, it's important that if you do report on a notice in your paper or use that as a source, cite it as a source in the paper. A lot of times that doesn't happen. So tell people that this came from a notice that was published in our paper yesterday or the day before, whenever it was. So take every opportunity you can to educate your readers, and that's one way to do it.
And actually, Richard, I'm going to jump in here and give a little shameless plug for MDDC's editorial contest, where we have a public notice category. So we're really trying to showcase the articles that are written with public notices as one of their sources. And that comes out quite often. Actually, I think APG does a great job of that. I think the last couple of years they have, they've won that category outright. And public notices are a treasure trove of information because they have to be published. So all sorts of nitty gritty crazy stuff comes through there.
Exactly. And one other thing, if you're going to do this, if you really want this to happen at your paper, this also has to happen. You need to make sure that someone is reading the notices in your paper. I have horror stories about notices. There's a publisher in California who actually lost the notice contract because he didn't read the notice in his newspaper that said the contract was up for renewal and he missed the deadline. So that was the worst case scenario. But there may be important stuff in the notices that you publish. So the main thing is make sure that you have it systematized. So there's someone at your paper who's actually reading the notices every week or every day or however often you publish them, and then reporting up the chain, or if it's a reporter writing stories about them and so forth. So make sure that happens. Here's another. This is a little bit different. This is also an example of a paper that reported a notice, a different kind of notice, right? So in this case, they did a story promoting the effectiveness of the notices in the paper, in their paper. This I obviously took it from their website, but the story appeared on their in the newspaper as well. This is a paper from Moore County, North Carolina. And so what happened in this particular case is, once a year they do a delinquent tax notice, which ends up being a multi-page special section of people and their names, people who owe taxes. So in this case, in Moore County a couple of years ago, there was $1.3 million outstanding debt and delinquent taxes. They published this notice, and within a month, they collected more than 60% of it. So over $800,000 of the $1.3 million was collected. So what did they do? They wrote a story about it. They called up the client. The client in this case was, I think, I don't know if it's a tax assessor, whoever it was that's responsible for publishing the delinquent tax notice. They called him and he talked about how useful it was because people don't like to see their name in the newspaper. I think that's a key fact, right? Is you can publish it. People don't like to see their name on the internet, but it's easier to hide. People hate locally to see a story with their name in it. And so print is an important component. And so if you have something like this where you publish a notice and it has an impact and it's newsworthy, and I would argue that in this case it is newsworthy, tell people about it. Take the opportunity to educate people. This one's a hard one, right? To help clients meet statutory requirements, it's hard because this public notice statutes are different in every state, and they're not always easy to parse. But this is one of our value propositions, right? Is that we are able to help people understand what the statutory requirements are. It's most important when you're dealing with private party notices, but government notices as well. It may be because people a lot of times in government don't know what they're doing, and I see that happen all the time. So you need to be the expert. Also, and this, yes. Is that Mike?
May I throw one caveat into that, please?
Sure.
I make sure that all of my people who give out statutory information emphasize that we are not licensed to practice law, and that their best bet is to check with their jurisdiction so that we don't wind up liable for something that they've done.
Okay, I think that's right. You're not practicing law. You don't want to be. I think there's, I guess, a way to handle it, and the way to handle it is if you know and you see something, maybe even as you see that something that is, there's a word that's wrong, or that they haven't got the date right, and sometimes it's a matter of just making sure that they're publishing notices that they should be publishing, if you can stay on top of that. So yeah, so you don't want to be giving legal advice, but you do want to help them get the notice right. And I think that, the papers that do that have a competitive advantage over papers that don't. And obviously accuracy is a related point. One thing I will say is I get Google alerts on public notice, right? So I follow what's going on all around the country, and I can tell you that I probably see on average 3 to 4 stories a month about a meeting that needed to be canceled, or a bid that needed to be resubmitted, or a bond issue that needed to be done over again because the notice was wrong. And that's embarrassing when that happens. I mean, I think sometimes you can't tell, but more often than not, it's not the newspaper's fault. Sometimes it is. More often than not, it's the government's fault, but that's part of our value proposition, is to making sure we get this stuff right. All right. And to be able to do that, you need to train your employees, right? So the thing that the government doesn't always do with their employees who are publishing the notice, you need to make sure that people who are dealing with the notices at your paper know what they're doing. And I know that the Press Association can be a great help with that. Promote public notice in your paper. So this is basically, this by the way, is an ad I took from MDDC. I think Rebecca, you must have done this a couple of years ago. If I got this correct, I have it. We have a whole archive of these kind of house ads to promote public notice. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that if you have space to run you have extra space and you can run a house ad promoting public notice, do it. Take the opportunity to educate your readers. Rebecca, did you want to add something there? All right.
Oh, I was just amazed. I don't recognize that ad. I'm going to have to now go back to our archives.
It may be before your time, because what happened was I talked about it yesterday, that we had this archive during the webinar, and someone asked me about it, and I looked and I realized, no, I haven't looked at this thing in years.
The ad is 11 years, Rebecca.
Okay, I don't feel so bad then. But we've been looking at spinning up a new house ad campaign, and it's really nice to know that we have great looking things already.
Well, so on this page, there's from that on our PNRC website, there's ads from all over from many different states. I think anyway. I think the point is, it's not so much, you're not going to be able to use the ads as they are because it'll say something about the Press Association, but there are ways that ideas for you to create your own ads, so you don't got to kind of reinvent the wheel. So there are a lot of clever ideas in there. So promote them in your paper. So that's house ads when you have the opportunity. And also columns and editorials help. People don't know about public notice, and we need to educate them. Some people don't know, let's put it that way. There's a lot of people that, especially in smaller towns, that read public notices religiously. So build relationships. Most importantly, I think you want to build relationships with your clients, and they're different in every jurisdiction. It may be the sheriff's office or the county clerk or the municipal clerk. the clerk of the court, whoever it is that's placing the notices in your paper. I said at the beginning, treat them like your regular advertisers. And so you have relationships, you talk to your regular advertisers, do that with your public notice clients. One of the key things here is these are, in a lot of cases, and I'm not sure what you got going on, and maybe Rebecca can fill me in here, but in a lot of states, the enemies, when I say the enemies, the people that are trying to get rid of newspaper notice, they tend to be led by the associations for counties, for municipal associations, and those are generally who we're fighting when these battles come up. And so those are your clients. And one of the reasons, in some cases, they want to get rid of the notices because the government doesn't like to tell people what they're doing. It's just a fact of life. That may be part of it. And I think to the extent that it's because it's hard for them to publish a notice, that's what we want to avoid, right? We want to make it as easy as possible. We want to do, again, treat them like your regular customers. You want that customer to continue publishing notices in your paper, even if they have to. They're required by statute. Don't treat them the same way. So build relationships with those folks, and if you can turn them from enemies into supporters, the Rebecca will have them testify at hearings, I think, if you can get and so
I would love that. And just to add to that point, we've had examples on sort of both sides of that. So we have had legislation appear in Maryland, local bill legislation appear at the state legislature, specifically because a county was having to go through so many backflips to be able to place their notices. So this was in a county where the public notice publications were weekly, so they're not daily, and they had to place in, I think, 2 or 3 different publications, and the deadline for 2 of those 3 publications was really far ahead of time and very confusing. And so because they had to publish three consecutive weeks and the deadline was so off, it wound up taking them like 6 or 7 weeks to publish all of the notices that they needed to do for almost anything. And it's really hard to justify to a legislator and even to ourselves why it needs to be that complicated. So I think encouraging a little self-reflection and looking inside your own operation to really be more client-centered. Our members do that every day on the display ad side or the digital advertising side, but I find that many publications just kind of think, well, public notice just always comes in. We don't need to make it easy. And that will bite you sooner or later, because people get angry about that and then say, well, gosh, why should we do this?
Yeah,
now,
on the
flip side, let me just complete that thought. On the flip side, when there was a big push to remove the notices for storage auctions, when someone doesn't pay their self-storage bill, their locker goes to auction. We did lose those notices in both Maryland and Delaware. That was a big push. But many storage unit operators continue to publish in the paper out of an abundance of caution. Obviously, we encourage them to do that, but they find it a very effective way to publicize the sale and to operate their business. So that's an example where we don't see a tremendous, you would think, oh, you're not required to publish, so why would anyone publish? Those operators still do publish those notices because they're an effective way to get the word out. So you can see it going both ways. That's
really impressive, to be honest with you, because I know those self-storage, in every state, they're fighting not to have to publish notices. So the fact that they're doing it even though they're not required to. So I think, what you said, Rebecca, is exactly right. I think the way to put it is, if you put yourself in the shoes of the client, who has, in some cases, has no choice. You're the paper of record. That's where they need to publish the notice, but they can't. No one will answer the phone. They have ridiculous deadlines. They don't. It's not easy to publish. It's hard. it's just like Rebecca said, it's just going to kill us. One real quick, I'm only got one more point here, so I'll make a really quick horror story on top of Rebecca's horror story. There was one state, and this was, I don't know if you remember this, Rebecca, at the newspaper managers conference about 3 years ago. One state stood up, read a letter, a executive director of a state press association, read a letter from the chief of staff of the governor's office, and basically the chief of staff wrote him, and it was an email, and said, "Hey, we just had a cabinet meeting, and a bunch of our cabinet heads were complaining about how hard it is to publish notices in the newspaper. In the newspapers, can you help work with us to get your members to make it easier?" So here you got a situation where the governor is actually a supporter of public notice, and I guess it was a state that's an important public notice state, and the chief of staff is writing a letter to the executive director about it. So we don't want to get in that.
You, how are you?
So, and I think I got that's my last point here is, let me see if I can do this. So the only other thing I want to add here is prices should be reasonable. I mean, so I think I looked, and Rebecca, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think Delaware and Maryland, I'm not sure about DC, both do not have fee rates in the statute. So some states have tell you what the fees can be, some states don't. And so in those situations where they don't, so papers can charge whatever they want to charge, and there's no competition, don't take advantage of it. And I think this happens where people take advantage of it and charge ridiculous prices, and it hurts all of us. Unfortunately, the people who do that are probably not the same people who sit in on public notice webinars. So they may not, it's probably not you guys, but if that happens, and I know there are states where it does, somehow those people need to be talked to, is the best way I can say it. So that is it. And so if there are any questions, happy to take it. If you want to add anything, Rebecca.
Well, I would clarify, you are correct. There are no, per line rates or anything in Maryland, Delaware, or the district. And I would also note that sometimes we have a situation where if a jurisdiction thinks that the prices are usurious, they will find another vendor. That happened on the Eastern Shore. Another newspaper, they specifically asked, "Will you take our notices?" So government talks to one another. All those little counties, there's clerk of court conventions and register of will conventions, and they do talk. We've got a couple things on the chat. So from Janine, we have, how do you get Google alerts to public notices? Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Richard?
Yeah, so what I'm looking for is news, because I'm following what's going on all over the country. I want to get news. So I have alerts set. I don't know if you know how that works, but it's, these alerts that scour the web and find words or phrases that you're interested in. So I have my Google alert set up for public notice, legal ads, foreclosure notice. Sometimes I get stuff that you get unfortunately, you get a lot of false negatives. In other words, a lot of things that are just, from the public notice section of a newspaper, but I also see stories about public notice. Another way for you, so you don't have to set up the Google notices if you read our newsletter, by the way. So because I'm reporting on it there. So we do a monthly newsletter, and so if you go to pnrc.net, it'll be real easy for you to sign up for our email newsletter, so you can see what's going on around the country. And again, I know Maryland, Delaware, DC, like the state I'm in, Nevada, have been good public notice states. There's not I think there has been bills in Maryland where they're trying to take away all those, but there's the kind of bill that never even sees a hearing. So we're in pretty good states as opposed to states like Florida, Wyoming, Kentucky. There's some states, it has to do with political stuff. I think next year is going to be difficult for us around the country because of the budget issues. Now, public notice is a fraction of any local government's budget, but they'll use that as an excuse this year to get rid of notices, even though it wouldn't save them a whole lot of money, because there are obviously with COVID a lot of budget issues in different states. So
Sure.
hopefully that answered. What's the other one?
And so we have another chat question. So do you know anything about the requirements of retaining documents used to place notices? So of course you have your newspaper archive, which is always critical, but do you need to keep those source documents for a period of time?
I don't know of any state that has that requirement. So I think the requirement in some states is to provide a affidavit that the notice was published. I think that's one of the best practices I used to talk about was archiving. I've kind of taken it out just because I just think it's beyond our control at this point. So the idea is, even though it's not a law, one of the benefits of print over the internet is that there is a record. There's a historical record. Historians can use it. Government officials need to go back and look at things or whatever. I mean, it's good to have a historical record of public notices, and we're losing that in the internet era. So the best practice is to do bound volumes of each of your papers. I know that that's happening less and less. I think the other point I would say here about that, again, no law, but to the extent that you can preserve your papers for as long as you can, so there's an historical record of those notices, the better off we are. And so a lot of times I think papers make an agreement with a third party like a library. And I think the best practice there is just to make sure you understand what the agreement is with the library, so they can't just, decide to dump them out the back when they run out of room or whatever. Just make sure you understand what the agreement is when you give your newspapers to the library, that they're gonna preserve them for history.
And so, Richard, just to kind of follow up on that, do you think there's any need or requirement, morally or whatnot, to keep the source documents? So if I'm an advertiser and I send in my notice to creditors, does the newspaper need to keep my communication about that ad for any period of time? Or once it goes in the publication, maybe you keep it for as long as it takes to get the bill paid, or, however long you would keep display ad records. But do you need to keep all of the communications about an ad and its text after the ad is run?
That's a great question, and one that I've never been asked and never thought about before. I would say, definitely you want to make sure you have the evidence that there is a problem, right? And that like, if it's not your fault and it's someone else's fault, I think. Other than that, I can't think of the reason. So I think it would be the same with any other advertisement, right? You want to keep the documents and the emails and the voicemails or whatever that relate to the placement of that ad, just to make sure that if there is a problem, you can go back and kind of figure out what happened. Did I answer that question, Rebecca? Thanks for asking, because I never really thought about that before. So.
I think, to me, that makes sense, and that would be my recommendation as well. I would think you would retain the information for as long as you customarily retain the information that you would for like display ads or anything like that.
Right. Yeah.
So in my book, it's, as soon as the ad is paid, and just to kind of keep it straight, I would retain it for no more than 3 to 6 months, because why? Otherwise it's just gunking up your works.
Right. So it's not, again, so that's not the part. The part you want to keep is the ad itself in print, because it's weird, because the internet, has the capability to preserve things forever. It's just that it doesn't work like that. And I think that stuff on the internet gets lost and replaced all the time. There's been plenty of studies that show. So the fact that our newspaper will survive for 20 or 40 or 60 years, or however long the newspaper will, before it disintegrates, is an advantage we have, to the extent that we can act on that, I think it's helpful. Let me ask you one other. This is for you, Rebecca. It's about this kind of similar issue about the longevity of the notice. So you guys put the notices on your statewide website, or maybe someone else, a newspaper puts it on their website. Yeah, I'm guessing, like us here in Nevada, you get calls from people that say, "Hey, take that notice down. It's from 4 years ago, whatever it was," and that people are scouring their internet reputation and trying to deal with that, and so they want it taken down. I'm just curious how you deal with those situations.
It's sometimes in context of what the notice is. I just want to loop back for a second.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Judd from the Washington Times is sharing that he would keep the source documents because he's been called to testify in cases going back as far as 7 years. So
wow.
I don't know if anyone else has had that experience of that kind of deep dive into the past, but that's so that's another perspective there. So it seems like the jury's still out on how long to keep source documents.
Well, the other good thing about the 7 years is it coincides with IRS tax records. So
That's
7
true.
years is how long. So so if you don't want to think about it and just do it every 7 years, that probably makes sense too.
Yeah. So Richard, getting back to your question about, do we take notices down? And generally, I really try not to take notices down because they're a historical fact. You can't rewrite history in some ways. I do recognize that for many people, the internet makes those things so much more public than they ordinarily would be.
Right. Right.
And then there's also situations where they do pose a credible threat to the person. So, for instance, kind of no questions asked, we will take down name changes
Right.
once that has occurred, once the publication cycle is over. I recently had a situation where a woman who had been abused was named in a public notice, and she was frantic because her abuser could now find her more easily. And so I try and be empathetic to people's personal situations, but we don't, I generally don't try and I don't willingly take it down except in those instances. And the name change specifically, Maryland passed a law in the 2020 session that allows for a waiver of publication for in some instances for name changes. So that would be transgendered name changes, for a variety of reasons. So we try and be delicate there because we don't want to seem like jerks. We need to uphold our values, but we also want to make sure that we're not staining ourselves in the public eye on something that's not going to make a huge difference in the big scheme of the world, So I'm also hearing for just kind of looking at the chat here that it looks like people generally archive the email correspondence about the ads. And that seems to be pretty typical. And others are saying they never share documents unless it's that they require proof that the notice was actually ordered, or I guess you have the subpoena. So I'm noticing it's 1:52, and we like to keep these little babies to 45 minutes. So just want to call out any other questions, concerns, things you want to ask Richard at this point. And it looks like the chat's still going strong on archived email, likely trash everything that you've printed out. And Georgie, I think that's the case. If you have an archived email, there's no need to print it out. Just keep it, keep it on the web. All right. So with that, I will, after this is over, I will convert this to a video, send you the link along with Richard's slides and his email address. But Richard, for those kind of following along out in the ether, would you share your contact information if somebody has a question for you later?
Sure. Easiest one is because I got a bunch of different emails. Easiest is R Karpel, so it's first letter, first initial, last name. So it's RKARPEL at pnrc.net.
Terrific.
Which is the domain that you see on the screen there. So.
All right. Terrific. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody coming out for this. And Richard, definitely thank you for presenting to us, and we'll be in touch. Thanks so
Well,
much.
thank you. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, everybody.